When I moved into my first apartment after college, I thought I was finally getting the fresh start I needed. The complex wasn't anything fancy, just a standard building with some peeling paint and a small, overgrown courtyard. But it was affordable and only a short commute to work. Plus, it had a cozy feel to it, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough, at least most of them. The first time I noticed something was off was the second day I moved in. I was unpacking boxes in my bedroom when I felt that strange sensation you get when someone's watching you. My bedroom window faced the courtyard, and when I glanced out, there he was. My neighbor from the building across the way, standing at his window, staring straight into my apartment. I froze, unsure of what to do. He didn't flinch when our eyes met, just stood there, watching, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I quickly pulled the blinds down, trying to shake off the unease. It's no big deal, I told myself. He probably didn't even realize I saw him. But that wasn't the last time. Over the next week, every time I opened my blinds or even peeked out for some fresh air, he was there. Always standing in the exact same spot, just staring. I couldn't make out many details. His window was too far, but there was something unsettling about how still he was, like a statue placed to keep an eye on my every move. I mentioned it to my roommate Jenna, who shrugged it off. "He's probably just some old guy who's bored," she said. "Maybe he's got nothing better to do." Maybe she was right, I thought. But then things started getting stranger. One night I came home late from work. Jenna was still out and the apartment was dark. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard a faint sound, like someone tapping on glass. I flicked on the hallway light, walked toward the living room, and there it was again. The noise was coming from the window. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The blinds were drawn, but as I inched closer, I saw a shadow, a human shape right outside the glass. Someone was tapping, their silhouette barely visible through the thin fabric. I froze in place, a chill crawling down my spine. I didn't want to look, but my curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and yanked the blinds up. It was him, the man from the building across the way. He was standing right outside my apartment, his face pressed against the window, staring in at me with those same cold, unblinking eyes. I screamed and stumbled back. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled for my phone to call the police. But as I glanced back at the window, he was already gone. Just like that. No trace of him, no sign he had ever been there. The police came by, took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. He hadn't broken in, hadn't physically harmed me. They told me to keep my doors and windows locked and to call if he came back. Jenna thought I was overreacting. "You're stressed from work," she said. "Maybe you just imagined it." But I knew what I saw. And after that night, things only got worse. Over the next few days, I noticed little things around the apartment that were out of place. A glass I'd left on the counter was suddenly in the sink. My shoes weren't where I'd left them by the door. Jenna was hardly ever home, so it wasn't her. And that feeling of being watched, it never went away. One night I was sitting in the living room trying to unwind with some TV when I heard it again. The tapping. Slow, deliberate. Like someone wanted me to know they were there. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the window, yanking the blinds open, but no one was there. Instead, on the glass, written in something smeared and greasy, were the words, "I see you." I called the police again. This time they searched the building, questioned some of the neighbors, but no one knew anything. The man across the way? He denied everything, claimed he didn't even know who I was. After that, I was on edge constantly. I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every tap, every shadow outside the window sent me into a panic. Jenna suggested I move, but I couldn't afford to break the lease, and I didn't want to leave her alone. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was in bed trying to sleep when I heard the door creak open. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving through the apartment. Someone was inside. I grabbed my phone, dialing Jenna's number, but there was no answer. The footsteps grew closer, and then the door to my bedroom slowly pushed open. I held my breath, waiting for whoever, or whatever, was out there to reveal itself. But no one came in. The door swung fully open, and there, standing in the hallway, was a figure. Tall, thin, his face shadowed by the dim light from the living room. But I knew who it was, the man from across the way. I bolted out of bed, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The figure just stood there watching as I frantically told the operator that someone had broken into my apartment. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared back into the hallway. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they searched the building, he was gone. They found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. I moved out the next day, left Jenna to deal with the rest of the lease. I couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep another night knowing he could come back at any time. Now I live in a new apartment on the other side of town. I've got new locks, new blinds, and I'm constantly checking the windows to make sure no one's watching. When I first moved into my new apartment complex last year, the first few weeks were pretty quiet. The building was small, only 6 units, and most of my neighbors kept to themselves. It was nice, though. I had just started a new job, and the peace and quiet were exactly what I needed. But after about a month, I started noticing some weird things about the guy who had just moved into the apartment next to mine. His name was Greg, I think. He wasn't friendly, not in the way you'd expect someone in a small building to be. Every time I passed him in the hallway or shared an elevator, he'd barely acknowledge me, just a slight nod if that. No small talk, no introductions. Just silence and a blank stare. I didn't think much of it at first. Some people are just like that. But then things got weirder. One night around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of loud thuds coming from his apartment. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I thought maybe he was rearranging furniture or something, though the time of night made it strange. I tried to ignore it, but after a few nights of the same noise, I was starting to get annoyed. I even thought about knocking on his door to complain, but I wasn't keen on making things awkward with my new neighbor. A few weeks later, a woman from the building across the street went missing. Her name was Sarah. I didn't know her personally, but her face was everywhere. Flyers were plastered on every light pole, and the police even came by our building to ask if anyone had seen anything unusual. I didn't have anything to tell them. The whole neighborhood was shaken, though, especially since Sarah had gone missing without a trace. There were no leads, no suspects, just a huge void where she used to be. The strangest thing was that Greg didn't seem fazed at all. While everyone else was talking about the disappearance, posting on social media, and speculating about what might have happened, Greg was just unaffected. No curiosity, no concern. It was like he didn't care, which felt off. One night, maybe 2 weeks after Sarah disappeared, I came home late from work. As I was unlocking my door, I heard movement behind Greg's door, and suddenly, the door creaked open slightly. He poked his head out and gave me this unnerving look. His eyes seemed darker than usual, and his face was gaunt, almost sickly. Before I could say anything, he muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make out what he said, but the tone was cold. I didn't stick around to ask questions. A few days later, there was this awful stench coming from his apartment. It was so bad I thought something had died in there. I assumed it was trash or maybe spoiled food, but it was rank enough to make me gag every time I walked by his door. It didn't go away either. It just got worse. I almost knocked on his door to say something, but every time I got close, I'd hear those same dragging noises and immediately back off. I decided I'd report it to the landlord the next day if it didn't clear up. That night, something snapped. I was in bed, trying to sleep through the smell and the now frequent banging noises, when I heard a loud crash. It wasn't just a thud this time. It sounded like something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a series of muffled grunts. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building manager. I told him about the smell, the noise, everything. To my surprise, he seemed just as concerned. He said he'd call the police and check it out. A couple of hours later, I heard the police knock on Greg's door. I didn't dare go outside, but I listened from the safety of my own apartment. At first, there was no answer, but after a while, I heard Greg's door open. The police talked to him for a bit, but everything seemed calm. I thought maybe I was just overreacting, that it was nothing after all. But then the next day, everything changed. I came home from work, and the whole building was swarming with police. There were crime scene tapes blocking off Greg's apartment, and officers were going in and out. My stomach turned. I spotted my building manager standing near the entrance, looking pale as a ghost. I asked him what happened, and all he said was, "They found her." "Found who?" I asked, confused. "Sarah," he said, barely able to speak. "They found her in his apartment." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Greg had been living next to me this whole time with Sarah's body hidden inside his apartment. The dragging noises I'd heard. It was him moving her body. The smell wasn't just trash, it was her. They found her stuffed into a large trunk in his bedroom, wrapped in plastic. The thought made me sick. Apparently, Greg had no criminal record, nothing to indicate he was capable of something like this. The police wouldn't say much more, but the rumors spread fast through the building. People said Greg had a weird obsession with Sarah, that he'd been stalking her for months before she went missing. But nobody had any idea that he was capable of that. Now, as I sit here in my apartment, just one wall away from where her body was hidden for weeks, I can't shake the feeling of dread. How many times did I hear those noises and do nothing? How close did I come to knocking on his door? What if I had confronted him one of those nights? I'll never know what could have happened, and I don't think I want to. All I know is that I'm moving out as soon as I can. Moving to the suburbs was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of apartment living in the city, I wanted space, quiet, and a sense of peace. My new house wasn't huge, but it had a decent yard, tall trees that lined the property, and it was just far enough away from the noise of urban life. A perfect retreat, or so I thought. I'd lived there for about 3 months when I noticed the man next door. He lived in a worn-down, one-story house that looked out of place compared to the well-maintained homes around it. At first, I thought it was abandoned. The paint was peeling, the grass was overgrown, and I never saw anyone come or go. But after a week of keeping to myself, I saw him. He stood in the front yard one afternoon, staring blankly at my house. The first time I saw him, I waved politely, trying to be a friendly neighbor. He didn't wave back. He just stood there, unmoving. His eyes locked onto mine, but his face was void of expression, like he was looking through me. Unnerved, I quickly went back inside. The next day, I saw him again, this time in his backyard. He was staring at my house again, standing completely still. Something about him made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just a little strange. Everyone has their quirks, right? Weeks passed, and every time I stepped outside, he was there, watching. He never spoke, never waved, just stared. It wasn't long before I began to feel like I was being watched even when I was inside. Sometimes, when I'd be in the kitchen or living room, I'd glance out the window and see him standing in his yard, his eyes fixed on my house. I started to keep the blinds closed, but the feeling of his eyes on me never went away. One night, after a particularly stressful day at work, I decided to distract myself by cleaning. I had been meaning to check the air ducts and clean them out, so I grabbed a flashlight and a small vacuum and opened one of the vents in the hallway. The ducts were old and dusty, but big enough for someone to crawl through. As I crawled in to get a closer look, I couldn't help but remember the strange noises I'd been hearing at night. Scratching sounds, faint but persistent. I had chalked it up to rodents or maybe the house settling, but now inside the ducts, those sounds felt closer. I kept crawling, shining the flashlight ahead of me. The air was musty and the space felt tight. After a few feet, I reached a bend in the ductwork. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like something moving inside the duct. My heart pounded in my chest, but I pushed on, thinking maybe I could see where the noise was coming from. As I rounded the corner, the beam of my flashlight caught something something that made my blood run cold. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Inches away from my face, staring directly at me, was my neighbor. His head was tilted slightly, his lips pulled into the most unsettling grin I had ever seen. I gasped and instinctively pushed back and turned around, but in my panic, I didn't move fast enough. His hand shot out, grabbing my leg. I screamed, thrashing as hard as I could, but he held on with a grip that seemed impossibly strong. "Where are you going?" he whispered, his voice low and raspy. "We haven't even said hello yet." My heart pounded in my ears as I kicked harder, desperate to break free. His nails dug into my ankle, sending sharp pain through my leg. I kept kicking, adrenaline surging through me. Finally, one of my kicks landed hard against his face, and I felt his grip loosen. I scrambled backward, my hands shaking as I dragged myself out of the vent. I tumbled out of the opening and slammed the vent cover back into place. My heart was racing, and I could barely think straight. I ran to the nearest piece of furniture, a heavy dresser, and shoved it in front of the vent opening, blocking it completely. For a moment, I just stood there, my chest heaving, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He was in my house, inside the walls. I could still feel his hand on my leg, the way his nails had dug into my skin. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably. But I wasn't safe yet. My phone was in the other room. I bolted up, running down the hallway and grabbing it from the kitchen counter. With trembling hands, I dialed 911. As the phone rang, I kept glancing around, half expecting him to crawl out from another vent or worse, find another way inside. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man in my house. He's in the air vents. Please, send someone, I screamed. The operator remained calm, asking me to stay on the line and lock myself in a room until the police arrived. I grabbed a kitchen knife, just in case, and barricaded myself in the bathroom, praying they would get here fast. Minutes felt like hours as I sat huddled in the bathroom clutching the knife. I could hear the faint sounds of movement inside the walls, but nothing else. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens outside and the banging on my front door. "The police are here," the operator said. "Stay where you are until they find you." Relief washed over me as I heard the officers storm into the house. I could hear them calling out as they moved from room to room, searching for him. I stayed in the bathroom until one of the officers knocked on the door, letting me know it was safe. When I stepped out, the officer looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. "We found him," he said. "He was hiding in the duct system, just like you said." I nodded, still too shaken to speak. They led me outside, where an ambulance was waiting. As they checked me over for injuries, I saw them escorting my neighbor out in handcuffs. He looked different now, not the eerie, menacing figure from the vent, but disheveled and crazed. His eyes darted around and he was muttering something under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I didn't care. I was just glad he was gone. Later that night, after the police had finished questioning me, one of the officers gave me a piece of advice that still haunts me. "You should consider moving," he said quietly. "We've seen cases like this before, and people like him, they just don't stop." I took his advice and moved out.